Captain Saracen had seen empires rise and fall across 1,000 worlds, but she never expected to watch the most powerful galactic alliance in history beg for humanity's help while simultaneously plotting their extinction. The irony wasn't lost on her as she stood in the observation deck of the human flagship Defiance, watching the sleek vessels of the Hegemony Council approach with diplomatic flags raised, the same ships that had blockaded Earth just 5 years ago when humanity was still crawling out of their solar system like newborn cubs. The message from Supreme Chancellor Vexhai had been brief: the Devourers have broken through the outer rim. We require immediate human military assistance. No apologies for the trade restrictions. No acknowledgement of the decades of technological suppression. No mention of the colonies they'd glassed when humanity refused to submit to their protection. Now the predators had become prey, and the galaxy's unwanted stepchildren had become its only hope. Sarah's fingers traced the scar across her left temple, a reminder of the Battle of Proxima Station where she'd learned that mercy was a luxury the universe rarely afforded. Today, she would teach the Council what Niccolò Machiavelli had understood centuries ago: power isn't about who needs you, it's about who realizes they need you only when it's too late to matter. The real question wasn't whether humanity would help. The question was what price the galaxy would pay for ignoring them until desperation forced their hand. The diplomatic shuttle docked with all the grace of a dying whale, its elegant hegemony design clearly not built for the rough magnetic clamps of human engineering. Captain Saracen watched through the transparent aluminum viewing port as 3 figures emerged from the airlock, their movements stiff with barely concealed disgust at their surroundings. Supreme Chancellor Vexhai led the delegation, his tall, crystalline form catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the docking bay. Behind him followed Trade Minister Chuloth, whose tentacled lower body writhed with nervous energy, and General Thakmore, whose forearms hung loose at his sides in what Sarah recognized as a battle-ready stance despite the diplomatic nature of the visit. Captain Chen, Admiral Rodriguez's voice crackled through her comm unit. They're requesting immediate audience. Apparently, this can't wait for the scheduled meeting tomorrow. Sarah adjusted her uniform, making sure the battle ribbons were clearly visible across her chest. Each one represented a human victory achieved despite the Council's interference. Let them wait in Conference Room 7. The one with the uncomfortable chairs and the broken climate control. Ma'am, that might be seen as deliberately provocative. Good. Sarah turned away from the viewing port. They've had 47 years to treat us with basic respect. They can spend 47 minutes in an uncomfortable room. As she walked through the corridors of the Defiance, Sarah reflected on how dramatically things had changed. The ship itself was a testament to human ingenuity born from necessity. When the Hegemony Council had refused to share their advanced metallurgy techniques, human engineers had developed something better. When they blocked access to quantum computing matrices, humans had created neural processing networks that made their systems look primitive. The crew members she passed nodded respectfully, but she could see the questions in their eyes. Everyone knew about the Devourer crisis by now. The subspace communications networks had been buzzing with panicked transmissions from the outer rim colonies for weeks. Entire star systems going dark. Trade routes severed. Refugee fleets streaming toward the core worlds with tails of black ships that consumed everything in their path. Conference Room 7 was exactly as advertised. The air recycling system hummed loudly, creating an annoying background noise. The chairs were standard-issue human furniture, designed for human physiology and completely uncomfortable for most alien species. The lighting was several degrees too bright for most non-human eyes. Supreme Chancellor Vexhai stood as Sarah entered, his crystalline features reflecting the harsh light in sharp, uncomfortable angles. Captain Chen. We appreciate your willingness to meet with us during this crisis. Sarah remained standing, not offering the traditional gesture of hospitality. Chancellor. You mentioned something about the Devourers. Indeed. Vexhai's internal light dimmed slightly, a sign of stress among his species. They have penetrated deeper into Council space than our most pessimistic projections suggested. 7 core systems have gone silent in the past month alone. Trade Minister Chulotha's tentacles writhed more frantically. Our modeling suggests they will reach the mid-rim colonies within 6 standard months. The core worlds within 18 months. General Thakmore spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble. Our combined fleets have been unable to significantly slow their advance. Their technology appears to adapt to our weapons systems within hours of first contact. Sarah walked to the room's single window, looking out at the stars. In the distance, she could see the running lights of other human vessels. Not many, compared to the vast armadas the Council could field, but each one represented capabilities the aliens had systematically tried to deny humanity. Interesting tactical challenge, Sarah said without turning around. I'm curious though. Why bring this to us? Last I checked, humanity wasn't even granted observer status in Council military planning sessions. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Vexai spoke. Recent engagements have demonstrated that human tactical doctrine possesses certain, unique advantages against the Devourer threat. Sarah turned back to face them. You mean we've actually managed to hurt them? The engagement at Kepler Station, General Thakmore admitted reluctantly. Your forces destroyed 3 Devourer vessels with acceptable losses. No Council fleet has managed to destroy even one. Ah yes, Kepler Station. Sarah's smile held no warmth. The mining facility you claimed was strategically insignificant when we requested permission to establish defensive positions there. The same facility you told us to evacuate because it wasn't worth defending. Chulotha's tentacles had stopped their nervous writhing and now hung perfectly still, a sign of extreme discomfort. Captain, we understand there have been policy disagreements in the past. But surely the current crisis supersedes previous diplomatic tensions. Policy disagreements. Sarah tasted the words like something bitter. Is that what you call the Titan blockade? When your ships prevented medical supplies from reaching our colony during the plague outbreak? That was a quarantine measure, Vexai began. 3,000 people died. Sarah's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. Including my daughter. The room fell silent except for the annoying hum of the air recyclers. Sarah walked back to her position at the head of the table, but still didn't sit. Let me make sure I understand the situation, she continued. For nearly 5 decades, the Hegemony Council has restricted our access to advanced technologies, limited our territorial expansion, blocked our trade routes, and generally treated humanity like a quarantined species that might contaminate the galaxy with our primitive ways. Captain Chuloth started. Sarah held up a hand for silence. Now you're facing an enemy that your superior technology and sophisticated military doctrine can't handle. An enemy that we've somehow managed to hurt. And you want our help. The Devourers threaten all sentient life in this galaxy, Vexai said, his crystalline form brightening with urgency. Surely you understand that human survival depends on stopping them before they reach the core worlds. Sarah finally sat down, folding her hands on the table. Actually, I'm not sure it does. You see, the Devourers seem to be following the major trade routes and focusing on high-value Council worlds. Our colonies are mostly off the beaten path, in systems you've declared worthless. We might actually survive quite well while you burn. General Thakmore's forearms tensed visibly. You would allow billions of sentient beings to die out of spite? Spite? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. General, spite would be actively helping the Devourers. What I'm describing is simple cost-benefit analysis. Why should humanity spend our limited resources and risk our people's lives to save a civilization that has never shown us anything but contempt? She stood up again, beginning to pace around the table. The 3 council representatives had to turn awkwardly in their uncomfortable chairs to follow her movement. But, let's say, hypothetically, that we did decide to help. What would you offer in return? Vexai's form brightened hopefully. Full council membership. Access to all trade routes. Recognition of your territorial claims. The same things you should have offered decades ago when we could have been allies instead of desperate strangers. Sarah stopped pacing and fixed the Chancellor with a steady stare. What else? Technology sharing agreements, Chuloth added quickly. Access to our manufacturing networks. Preferred trading partner status. Still catching up to where we should have been all along.
Sarah resumed pacing. Keep going.
General Thacmore spoke reluctantly. Military cooperation agreements.
Joint training exercises. Shared intelligence networks. Sarah nodded slowly. Now we're getting somewhere. But here's the problem with everything you've offered. It all depends on Council goodwill. Once the Devourer crisis is over, what's to stop you from returning to the old policies? What guarantees do we have? The three aliens exchanged glances. Finally, Vexhai spoke. What would you require? Sarah stopped pacing and sat down again. Permanent seats on all Council decision-making bodies. Veto power over policies affecting human space. And war crimes tribunals for the officials responsible for the Titan blockade and the Proxima Station incident. The silence this time was deafening. Chulotha's tentacles began their nervous writhing again.
General Thacmore's arms crossed defensively.
Vexhai's internal light flickered rapidly.
Those terms are excessive, the Chancellor said finally.
Are they? Sarah leaned forward.
Your own intelligence estimates give you 18 months before the Devourers reach the core worlds. How many billions of your people will die while you debate whether our terms are excessive? She stood up again, signaling the end of the meeting. You know where to find us when you're ready to negotiate seriously.
Until then, good luck with your superior technology and sophisticated military doctrine.
As the three council representatives filed out, looking considerably less composed than when they'd arrived, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The game had begun, and, for the first time in decades, humanity held the winning cards.
But she knew this was only the opening move.
The real test would come when the council realized just how badly they needed humanity's help, and how little humanity needed them in return. 3 weeks after the failed diplomatic meeting, Sarah stood in the command center of Fortress Luna, humanity's primary military installation hidden on the dark side of Earth's moon. The massive underground complex had been carved out over decades, each expansion funded by profits from the illegal salvage operations the Council pretended not to know about. Admiral, incoming priority transmission from the Council Fleet Command, Lieutenant Commander Park announced from her station.
It's marked as urgent diplomatic correspondence.
Put it on the main screen, but don't bother with the formal protocols, Admiral Rodriguez replied. He'd been promoted to head of Human Defense Forces after the previous admiral had died during the Proxima Station massacre. His left arm was still cybernetic, another gift from the Council's protection. The holographic image of Supreme Chancellor Vexhai materialized, but his usually pristine crystalline form looked dimmed and fractured. Behind him, Sarah could see the emergency lighting of what appeared to be a command bunker.
Admiral Rodriguez, Captain Chen, Vexhai began without preamble.
The situation has deteriorated significantly since our last communication.
Sarah exchanged a glance with Rodriguez.
The Chancellor's usual diplomatic composure had cracked, revealing something that looked suspiciously like panic.
How significantly? Rodriguez asked.
The Devourers have taken the Nexus Gate array.
Vexhai's form flickered as the transmission wavered. They now have access to instantaneous travel across 17 sectors.
Our most optimistic projections now give the core world 6 months before direct assault. Lieutenant Commander Park pulled up a tactical display showing the affected region. Red indicators marked Devourer-controlled systems, spreading like a cancer through the galaxy's most vital shipping lanes.
The loss of the Nexus gates meant they could strike anywhere within the network without warning. That does change things, Sarah admitted.
But, I notice you still haven't accepted our terms.
Vexhai's form brightened with agitation. Captain, your demands would fundamentally alter the balance of power within the Council. We cannot simply, Chancellor, Rodriguez interrupted.
Are you calling to accept our terms, or are you calling to waste our time with more excuses?
The transmission cut to static for several seconds.
When it resumed, General Thacmore had joined Vexhai in the frame. His usually immaculate uniform was torn and stained, and Sarah could see fresh battle scars across his carapace.
We've authorized a partial acceptance of your terms, Thacmore said.
Full council membership and technology sharing, effective immediately upon your military assistance.
Partial acceptance? Sarah's tone was dangerous.
General, I don't think you understand your situation. She gestured to Park, who brought up another display. This one showed human space in comfortable green, with defensive positions clearly marked.
While you've been losing systems to the Devourers, we've been preparing. Our automated defense platforms are online.
Our deep space monitoring stations are tracking every ship movement in a 50 light-year radius.
Our colonies are self-sufficient and heavily fortified. Sarah walked closer to the transmission pickup. We can wait this out, General. The question is whether you can. Thacmore's forearms clenched into fists.
You're gambling with the lives of every sentient being in the galaxy.
No, Sarah corrected.
You gambled with those lives when you spent 5 decades treating potential allies as threats.
We're just the ones who prepared for the consequences of your arrogance.
The transmission shifted again, and Trade Minister Chuloth appeared alongside the other two. His tentacles were wrapped tightly around his body in a defensive posture Sarah had learned indicated extreme stress.
Captain, Chuloth said, the economic implications alone are your problem, not ours, Rodriguez finished. Our economy has been isolated from the Council's systems for decades.
We'll survive the collapse just fine. Sarah moved to another console and activated a recording system.
Since this is clearly a negotiation, let me be absolutely clear about our current offer.
She pulled up a prepared document that had been waiting in the system for weeks.
Permanent human membership on all Council governing bodies. Veto power over military deployments in human space. Full technology sharing, including previously restricted quantum engineering and biological modification techniques. Complete autonomy over human territorial expansion.
War crimes tribunals for officials responsible for the Titan blockade, the Proxima Station incident, and the Kepler sanctions. The 3 council representatives were silent as the terms appeared on their screens. Additionally, Sarah continued, immediate reparations for damages incurred during the blockade periods.
Full diplomatic immunity for human vessels in Council space.
And command authority over any joint military operations against the Devourers.
Vexhi's form flickered rapidly. Command authority? You want humans to command Council fleets?
We want competent leadership, Sarah replied. Your fleets have been retreating for months. Our forces have actually hurt the Devourers.
Draw your own conclusions.
General Thacmore leaned forward aggressively. You have destroyed 3 Devourer vessels in one engagement. We have been fighting them across dozens of systems and, losing every single one, Rodriguez interrupted. General, your tactical doctrine is built around overwhelming firepower and technological superiority. The Devourers adapt to both within hours.
Our doctrine is built around unpredictability, improvisation, and acceptable losses. That's what's keeping us alive.
Sarah returned to her position in front of the main screen. Chancellor, you have 6 hours to provide a formal response. After that, we'll assume you prefer to handle this crisis with your existing resources.
6 hours? Chulotha's tentacles writhed frantically.
The Council of Worlds cannot convene and then use emergency powers, Sarah cut him off. You've used them before when it suited your purposes. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the command center in relative quiet. Sarah could hear the distant hum of the facility's fusion reactors and the soft clicking of console keys as technicians maintained their monitoring stations.
Think they'll accept? Rodriguez asked. Not willingly, Sarah replied.
They'll try to negotiate, make counteroffers, play for time.
Standard diplomatic tactics.
Lieutenant Commander Park looked up from her station.
Ma'am, I'm reading massive subspace communications traffic from Council space. Looks like emergency session protocols. Good.
Sarah walked to the strategic planning table where holographic displays showed the current disposition of human forces.
While they debate, let's make sure they understand exactly what they're negotiating for.
She activated the fleet communication system.
All station commanders, all ship captains, this is Captain Chen. Initiate Protocol 7. Full defensive deployment. I want every human asset visible and accounted for.
Across human space, hidden bases powered up their transmission arrays.
Stealth ships dropped their cloaking and announced their positions. Orbital defense platforms went to full active scanning mode. Within hours, the true extent of human military capability would be impossible to ignore.
Park, patch me through to Commander Williams at the Kepler Station's salvage operation, Sarah ordered. Williams' face appeared on a secondary screen, his expression curious.
Captain, we're just finishing up with the Devourer wreckage analysis. The results are interesting. Save the details for later, Commander.
Right now, I need you to make sure the Council's intelligence networks know exactly what we found in those ships.
Williams grinned. Accidental intelligence leak? I understand, Captain. The next few hours would be critical.
Sarah had learned long ago that power was rarely about what you could do, but about what others believed you could do. The Council was about to discover that their unwanted stepchildren had grown up to be very dangerous indeed.
Admiral Rodriguez joined her at the strategic table.
You know, once we help them with the Devourers, they'll start plotting against us again.
Sarah nodded. Probably. But, by then, we won't be the desperate colonists begging for scraps. We'll be equals. And equals are much harder to dismiss.
She pulled up the latest intelligence reports on Devourer movements. Besides, Rodriguez, Machiavelli had another piece of advice about power dynamics.
Which was? Sarah's smile was sharp as broken glass. It's better to be feared than loved.
And, we're about to become very, very scary. The Council's acceptance arrived 4 hours and 37 minutes after Sarah's deadline, transmitted via emergency diplomatic channels with authorization codes from the highest levels of government.
Sarah read the document while standing in the observation lounge of the battle cruiser Retribution, watching the largest human fleet in history prepare for departure. They agreed to everything? Admiral Rodriguez asked, reviewing his own copy of the treaty. Everything.
Sarah scrolled through the legal text, noting the desperate speed with which it had been drafted. Full membership, territorial autonomy, technology sharing, war crimes tribunals, and, most importantly, operational command of all anti-Devourer forces. Through the reinforced windows, she could see the sleek forms of Council vessels already arriving at the designated rally point. Hundreds of ships representing dozens of species, all now under human command.
The irony was almost poetic.
Captain Morrison of the Retribution approached with a tactical data pad.
Ma'am, we're receiving fleet composition reports from the Council forces. It's impressive.
Sarah took the pad and scanned the numbers. Over 3,000 ships, including 47 Dreadnought-class vessels and carriers holding enough fighters to darken local space.
More firepower than humanity had ever imagined possessing.
And, completely useless, she murmured, handing the pad to Rodriguez.
Look at the battle reports from their previous engagements. Every single formation was textbook perfect. Every tactical decision followed established doctrine.
And every engagement ended in retreat or destruction.
Rodriguez studied the data. Standard hegemony battle doctrine.
Concentrated firepower, hierarchical command structure, technology dependence.
They're fighting the last war, not this one. Exactly. Sarah activated the ship's communication system. All human ship commanders, report to Conference Room Alpha for tactical briefing. Council liaison officers are invited to observe.
An hour later, the room was packed with the cream of humanity's military leadership.
Captain Torres from the stealth destroyer Ghost Protocol. Commander Singh from the experimental weapons platform Prometheus. Captain O'Brien from the carrier New Dublin.
And dozens of others, each representing ships and crews that had learned to fight smart rather than fight fair. At the far end of the room, clearly uncomfortable in chairs designed for human physiology, sat the Council liaison officers. General Thacmore was present, along with Admiral Zyxtai of the Aquatic Confederation and War Leader Groth of the Silicon Collective. Sarah stood at the front of the room, behind her a holographic display showing the current Devourer advance patterns. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored allies, she began, by now you've all seen the intelligence reports on Devourer capabilities. They're fast, they adapt quickly, and they don't seem to suffer from the same resource constraints as conventional forces. She gestured to the display, which shifted to show engagement records. However, our analysis of the Kepler station battle has revealed several critical vulnerabilities.
Commander Williams appeared on screen from his mobile laboratory ship.
Based on our examination of the Devourer wreckage, we've identified 3 key weaknesses. First, their adaptation protocols require approximately 37 minutes to fully analyze and counter new weapon configurations. Second, their ships prioritize efficiency over redundancy, disable their primary systems, and they're effectively helpless. Third, and most importantly, their command structure appears to be entirely networked. Disrupt their communication links and individual ships lose coordination. General Thacmore leaned forward. Our intelligence indicated adaptation times of less than 10 minutes.
Your intelligence was wrong, Sarah replied bluntly. Because your engagements lasted less than 10 minutes. You hit them with everything you had, they adapted, and you retreated. We hit them with probing attacks, studied their responses, and then exploited their adaptation cycle. She brought up a new display showing human tactical doctrine. This is how we're going to win.
Not through overwhelming firepower, but through systematic exploitation of their weaknesses. Captain Torres raised her hand.
What about the numerical disparity?
Intelligence suggests there are thousands of Devourer ships.
Sarah smiled. That's where our new Council allies become useful.
Not as warriors, but as resources.
She gestured to Admiral ZYX Tai.
Admiral, your aquatic Confederation ships have the most advanced sensor arrays in the galaxy.
We need you to map Devourer communication networks.
ZYX Tai's gills fluttered with surprise. Our sensors are designed for deep ocean navigation, not combat. Exactly, Sarah interrupted.
Which means the Devourers won't recognize them as a threat until it's too late.
Your ships will operate as our reconnaissance network. She turned to War Leader Groth. Your Silicon Collective vessels have the best jamming capabilities. We need you to disrupt Devourer communications at critical moments.
Groth's crystalline form resonated with what Sarah had learned to recognize as curiosity. This would require us to operate within their formation perimeters.
Extremely dangerous. Less dangerous than facing them in conventional battle, Rodriguez pointed out. Your losses in previous engagements were over 60%. Our plan gives you a survival rate of over 90%.
Sarah pulled up a tactical simulation.
Here's how it works. Council forces provide reconnaissance, jamming, and target designation.
Human forces provide the actual combat capabilities.
We hit fast, rotate weapons configurations every 35 minutes, and focus on communication nodes and command vessels. The simulation showed human ships darting in and out of Devourer formations like mosquitoes, each attack coordinated to prevent adaptation while Council vessels provided support from safe distances.
General Thacmore's forearms were tense with skepticism.
This plan requires extraordinary coordination. One mistimed attack will be handled by commanders who've been fighting for their lives against superior forces for decades, Captain O'Brien interrupted. General, with respect, your people have had the luxury of overwhelming technological superiority for centuries.
Ours have had to be clever to survive. Sarah brought up the final phase of the tactical plan.
The key to this entire strategy is patience.
We don't try to destroy their entire fleet at once.
We whittle them down, force them to adapt to multiple different tactical approaches simultaneously, and create chaos in their command structure.
She paused, looking around the room. This war won't be won in a single decisive battle. It'll be won by making the Devourers pay an unacceptable price for every system they take. Admiral ZYX Tai's gills fluttered again. Captain Chen, this strategy assumes the Devourers will continue their current advance pattern. What if they adapt their overall strategy?
Then, we adapt faster, Sarah replied.
That's what humans do.
The briefing continued for another 2 hours, with human commanders and council officers working through tactical details and coordination protocols. Sarah watched with satisfaction as species that had barely communicated with each other for decades began developing the foundation of genuine military cooperation.
When the meeting ended, General Thacmore approached her privately.
"Captain," he said, his voice unusually subdued.
"I must ask. Do you believe this plan will actually work?"
Sarah studied the general's scarred carapace, noting the fresh wounds from his recent battles against the Devourers.
"General, in 30 years of military service, I've learned that the best plans aren't the ones most likely to succeed. They're the ones that fail in ways you can recover from." She gestured toward the viewing ports where the combined fleet was visible in the distance. "Your people's plans failed catastrophically because they assumed technological superiority would be enough. Our plan assumes we'll need to improvise, adapt, and sacrifice to win." Thacmore was quiet for a long moment. "I have studied human military history as part of my preparation for this conflict. Your species seems to excel at winning wars that should be impossible to win." "We excel at surviving when everyone else expects us to die," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference." As the general left, Sarah remained in the observation lounge, watching the fleet preparations. Tomorrow they would engage the Devourers in the first coordinated counterattack since the crisis began. The outcome would determine not just the fate of the galaxy, but the future relationship between humanity and the Council. She thought again of Machiavelli's words about power and recognition. The Council had ignored humanity when they seemed weak and irrelevant. Now they hung on every human tactical decision like desperate students learning from a master. Soon, they would learn that the humans they dismissed as primitive colonists had become the most dangerous military force in the galaxy. And, by the time this war was over, no one would ever make the mistake of underestimating humanity again. The first coordinated strike against the Devourer fleet occurred in the Helix Nebula, where long-range sensors had detected a major enemy staging area. Sarah watched from the command bridge of the Retribution as 3,000 ships moved into position with a precision that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. "Ghost Protocol reporting sensor contact," Captain Torres announced over the comm. "Devourer fleet composition matches intelligence estimates. Approximately 400 vessels, including 12 command-type signatures." Sarah studied the tactical display, noting how the enemy ships were arranged in perfect geometric formations. "Predictable," she murmured. "They're still thinking like a conventional military force." Admiral Rodriguez, commanding from the battle cruiser Defiance, appeared on the communications screen. "All human units are in position. Council support vessels report ready status." "Initiate Phase 1, Sarah ordered." What happened next would have horrified traditional military commanders. Instead of a massive frontal assault, the human ships scattered like a school of fish disturbed by a predator. They approached the Devourer formation from dozens of different angles, each group using different weapon configurations and attack patterns. The Devourers responded exactly as predicted. Their ships moved to intercept, adapting their defensive systems to counter the various human weapons. But, every 35 minutes, the human ships switched to completely different tactics, forcing the Devourers to restart their adaptation cycles. "Prometheus reporting successful strike on primary communication node," Commander Singh announced. "Enemy coordination is degrading." Sarah watched the tactical display as individual Devourer ships began operating independently, their perfect formations dissolving into chaos. This was the moment human doctrine truly shined, when careful preparation met battlefield improvisation. "New Dublin, deploy fighter screen Delta 7, she ordered. "Ghost Protocol, target the isolated command vessel at grid reference 449. Captain O'Brien's voice crackled through the static. "Fighters away. Warning, we're seeing adaptive behavior in their point defense systems." "Expected," Sarah replied. "Continue attack pattern for another 20 minutes, then rotate to pattern Gamma." From her position, Sarah could see the Council ships maintaining their support roles with admirable discipline. Admiral ZYXDI's sensor vessels were feeding targeting data with unprecedented accuracy, while War Leader Groth's jamming ships disrupted Devourer communications at precisely the right moments. General Thakmore's voice came over the command channel. Captain Chen, enemy reinforcements approaching from the outer system. Estimated arrival in 45 minutes. Sarah smiled grimly. Perfect timing. All human vessels, prepare for Phase 2.
Council support vessels, maintain position and continue mission profiles.
Phase 2 involved something that would have seemed like madness to conventional military thinking.
Instead of retreating from the approaching reinforcements, the human ships began herding the damaged Devourer vessels directly toward their own incoming forces.
What are they doing? She heard Admiral Zyxtai ask over an open channel.
Teaching the Devourers about friendly fire, Rodriguez replied with dark humor. The plan worked exactly as intended. The Devourer reinforcements, arriving at high speed and eager to engage, found themselves firing through their own damaged vessels to reach the human ships. Their own adaptive technology began reacting to friendly weapon signatures, creating cascade failures throughout their defensive systems. Enemy fleet cohesion is collapsing, reported Lieutenant Commander Park from her sensor station. We're reading massive system failures across multiple ship classes. Sarah studied the battle display, watching as nearly 400 Devourer vessels were systematically dismantled not by superior firepower, but by superior understanding of their own limitations. All units, begin salvage operations, she ordered. I want every piece of intact Devourer technology recovered and analyzed. The battle had lasted 6 hours.
Human casualties were minimal, 8 ships damaged, none destroyed. Devourer losses were catastrophic, over 60% of their fleet disabled or destroyed, with the remainder retreating in complete disarray. But Sarah knew the real victory wasn't in the immediate tactical success. It was in what the battle demonstrated to every species in the galaxy.
Captain, General Thakmore's voice carried a note of awe that hadn't been there before.
I have never seen anything like this.
Your forces turned a numerically superior enemy against itself.
General, Sarah replied, this is how humans have been fighting for millennia.
We study our enemies, identify their weaknesses, and then create situations where those weaknesses become fatal. Over the next several weeks, news of the Helix Nebula victory spread throughout Council space.
More importantly, it spread through the Devourer fleet network.
Sarah began receiving intelligence reports that the enemy was modifying their tactics, trying to compensate for the vulnerabilities humans had exploited. They're learning, Rodriguez observed during a strategy meeting aboard the Retribution.
Their formation patterns are becoming more flexible, and they're implementing redundant communication systems. Sarah nodded. Expected. But look at the cost.
She brought up a strategic analysis showing Devourer fleet movements over the past month. They're having to dedicate 30% more resources to defensive systems.
Their advance has slowed by 40%.
And they're avoiding direct engagements in favor of hit-and-run attacks. Captain Torres, recently promoted after her exceptional performance at Helix, raised a tactical concern.
Ma'am, doesn't this make them more dangerous in the long term? A learning enemy is worse than a predictable one.
Not necessarily, Sarah replied.
A learning enemy is also a cautious enemy.
And caution is incompatible with the kind of rapid expansion they need to maintain strategic momentum.
The proof came 2 months later when human-led forces engaged Devourer fleets at 3 different systems simultaneously.
In each case, the enemy response was hesitant, defensive, and ultimately ineffective. They had become so focused on countering human tactics that they had lost their original aggressive edge. War leader Groth, who had initially been skeptical of human command capabilities, now requested permanent assignment to human-led operations. Your species has accomplished something remarkable, he told Sarah during a planning session. You have made the hunters afraid of their prey.
But Sarah knew the war was far from over.
Intelligence reports indicated that the Devourers were consolidating their remaining forces into a massive fleet, preparing for what appeared to be a final, desperate assault on the core worlds. They're going to throw everything they have left at us, she told her senior commanders. One massive push designed to overwhelm our tactical advantages through sheer numbers.
Admiral Rodriguez studied the intelligence data. How massive are we talking about?
Conservative estimates suggest over 10,000 ships, Sarah replied. More than the entire Council Navy at its peak strength. The room fell silent. Even with all their tactical innovations, facing odds of 3-1 against an enemy that had learned to counter their strategies would be a challenge.
Captain Morrison spoke first. "Ma'am, we could request additional Council reinforcements. There are still several member species holding reserve fleets."
Sarah shook her head. "Those reserves are all we have left to defend the core worlds if we fail. Besides, conventional reinforcements won't help us against these numbers."
She brought up a new display showing human ship production facilities.
"We're going to win this war the same way we've won every battle so far. Not through overwhelming force, but through being smarter than our enemies." The plan she outlined was audacious even by human standards. Instead of meeting the Devourer superfleet in direct battle, they would allow it to advance toward the core worlds while systematically destroying its supply lines and communication networks.
"We turn their greatest strength into their greatest weakness," Sarah explained.
A fleet that size requires massive logistical support.
Cut those supply lines, and they become stranded deep in hostile territory. General Thacmore, who had become one of Sarah's most reliable allies, voiced the obvious concern.
"Captain, this plan requires allowing the enemy to advance to within striking distance of our most important worlds."
"The political implications are less important than actual survival," Sarah cut him off.
"General, the Council spent decades making political decisions about military matters. That's how we ended up in this situation." She looked around the room at the assembled commanders, human and alien, working together with a unity that would have been impossible just months earlier. "The final battle is coming, and we're going to win it. Not because we have more ships or better weapons, but because we understand something the Devourers never learned."
"Which is?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. "That sometimes the best way to win a war is to let your enemy think they're winning it."
The final battle began not with the thunder of weapons, but with silence. Sarah stood in the command center of Fortress Luna, watching as the largest military force in galactic history approached the Sol system. 10,000 Devourer ships, their black hulls drinking in the light of distant stars, moving in formations that stretched across millions of cubic kilometers. "All human vessels, maintain radio silence," she ordered.
"Let them think they've achieved complete surprise."
The Devourer superfleet had indeed achieved something remarkable. They had crossed 12 sectors of heavily defended space, apparently suffering minimal losses, and now stood poised to strike at the heart of human civilization. To any conventional military analysis, it would appear that humanity's desperate gambit had failed catastrophically.
Which was exactly what Sarah wanted them to think.
Admiral Rodriguez reporting from Titan Station, came a carefully coded transmission.
"All assets are in position and awaiting your order."
Sarah nodded to Lieutenant Commander Park, who activated a holographic display showing the true scope of the trap they had spent 6 months preparing. The Devourer fleet was entering a system that had been transformed into the largest killing field in galactic history. Every asteroid in the belt had been hollowed out and converted into a weapon platform.
Every gas giant moon concealed automated defense systems.
Even the orbital debris around Earth had been weaponized, turned into kinetic projectiles with devastating potential. But the real genius of the plan wasn't in the defensive preparations. It was in what the Devourers didn't know about the ships they had been chasing for half a year.
"Captain Torres, report status," Sarah commanded.
"Ghost Protocol and Stealth Flotilla are positioned throughout enemy formation," Torres replied.
"We've been shadowing them for 3 weeks.
They still have no idea we're here."
The stealth ships represented the culmination of human military engineering.
While the Council had focused on building bigger and more powerful vessels, humanity had perfected the art of invisibility. Ships that could hide in the sensor shadows of enemy vessels, becoming ghosts in the machine of war.
War Leader Groth, jamming status?
Silicon collective vessels are integrated within their supply convoy, Groth reported.
Their communication networks are completely compromised, though they remain unaware of the penetration.
Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The Devourers had spent months adapting to human tactics, learning to counter every strategy humanity had demonstrated. What they hadn't realized was that every battle had been a teaching moment, not for them, but for the humans who were studying their responses.
All stations, initiate final protocol, Sarah ordered. What happened next would be remembered in military academies for centuries.
The Devourer superfleet, confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority, began their assault on what they believed were the last defenses of human space. The first indication that something was wrong came when their supply convoys, positioned safely behind the main battle fleet, began exploding in carefully timed sequence. The Silicon Collective vessels, disguised as captured council ships for months, revealed their true nature and began systematically destroying the logistical support that kept the massive fleet operational.
Supply Convoy Alpha is eliminated, War Leader Groth reported with satisfaction. Enemy fuel reserves are now critically low. Simultaneously, the stealth flotilla activated throughout the Devourer formation.
Hundreds of ships that had been invisible suddenly appeared on sensors, their weapons targeting command vessels and communication nodes with devastating precision.
Direct hits on primary command cluster, Captain Torres announced. Enemy fleet coordination is collapsing.
But the masterstroke came when the Devourers tried to respond with their adaptive protocols. For months, they had been learning to counter human weapons and tactics. Now, as they attempted to adapt to the surprise attack, they discovered that humanity had been feeding them false information.
The weapons signatures they had learned to counter were decoys.
The tactical patterns they had studied were deliberately flawed demonstrations. Every adaptation they had made over the past year was not just useless, but counterproductive. Enemy adaptive systems are causing cascade failures, reported Commander Singh from the experimental weapons platform Prometheus. They're adapting to counter weapons we're not using and ignoring the ones we are. Sarah watched the tactical display as the mighty Devourer superfleet began tearing itself apart.
Ships fired on their own vessels as their identification systems failed.
Command protocols collapsed as communication networks were systematically compromised. Adaptive defensive systems turned against their own platforms as carefully planted false data corrupted their learning algorithms.
The battle lasted 18 hours.
When it was over, less than 300 Devourer ships remained intact, and most of those were fleeing toward the galactic rim in complete disorder.
Human losses were virtually non-existent.
Captain Shan, General Thakmore's voice carried a note of wonder that had become familiar over the past year. I have witnessed the complete destruction of the largest military force in galactic history, accomplished by a fleet one-third its size.
How is this possible?
Sarah turned to face the holographic image of the general. It's possible because we spent 50 years learning to fight enemies who thought we were primitive and irrelevant.
We became very good at being underestimated.
The aftermath of the battle brought changes that Sarah had been anticipating for months. Within days of the Devourer fleet's destruction, delegation after delegation arrived at human space, bearing gifts and treaty proposals from species who had never acknowledged humanity's existence. The crystalline hegemony offered exclusive mining rights to rare mineral worlds.
The Aquatic Confederation proposed joint research initiatives for terraforming technologies.
Even the proud Silicon Collective suggested formal military cooperation agreements. But Sarah's personal favorite was the message from Supreme Chancellor Vexhai. Captain Chen, the holographic image said, "The Council wishes to express our profound gratitude for humanity's role in ending the Devourer crisis.
We look forward to many centuries of peaceful cooperation between our peoples." Sarah had to admire the diplomatic language. No mention of the decades of oppression.
No acknowledgement of the trade blockades and territorial restrictions. Just gratitude and an assumption of future cooperation.
Admiral Rodriguez, she said after the transmission ended, what do you think the Chancellor really wants to say?
Rodriguez smiled grimly. I think he wants to say, please don't do to us what you just did to the Devourers. The reconstruction period that followed would reshape the galactic balance of power in ways that historians would debate for generations. The war crimes tribunals alone occupied legal scholars for years, as decades of suppressed evidence finally came to light. But, for Sarah, the most satisfying moment came during a council session 6 months after the final battle. She stood at the podium in the Great Assembly Hall, addressing representatives from hundreds of species, and announced humanity's first major policy initiative as full council members. The Human Defense Initiative will provide military training and defensive technology to any species threatened by external aggression, she declared. No species will ever again face extinction because they were deemed strategically insignificant. The applause was polite but uncomfortable. Every representative in the hall understood the subtext. Humanity was now powerful enough to protect others, which meant they were powerful enough to threaten those who had previously done the oppressing. After the session, war leader Groth approached her privately.
Captain Chen, I must ask. Did you always plan to become the galaxy's dominant military power? Sarah considered the question. War leader, we didn't plan to become dominant. We planned to survive. The dominance was just a side effect of getting very good at survival.
She looked out the assembly hall's massive windows at the stars beyond. Machiavelli once wrote that it's better to be feared than loved, but he also wrote that the best outcome is to be respected.
Fear fades when people get used to it.
Love is unreliable and can turn to hate. But respect is earned through competence and maintained through consistency.
Groth's crystalline form resonated thoughtfully. And now the galaxy respects humanity.
Now the galaxy has no choice but to respect humanity, Sarah corrected.
There's a difference.
Years later, military historians would analyze the Devourer War as a perfect example of asymmetric warfare doctrine. They would study the tactical innovations, the strategic patience, and the psychological warfare that had turned a seemingly hopeless situation into humanity's greatest victory. But Sarah knew the real lesson of the war was simpler and more profound.
Power wasn't about what you could do to your enemies.
It was about making sure your enemies understood what you could do to them, and then never giving them cause to forget it. The galaxy had ignored humanity when they were weak and desperate for recognition. Now that humanity was strong enough to command attention, recognition came automatically. As she walked through the corridors of the council headquarters, past alien dignitaries who stepped aside respectfully and offered the formal courtesies due to a senior member species, Sarah reflected on how completely the dynamic had changed. They only see you once you stop needing them, she thought.
But once they see you, they never stop watching.
And, in a galaxy full of predators, sometimes being watched was the greatest safety of all.